My name is Madeline Taylor. I am 36 years old, and for 12 Christmases in a row, my family celebrated without me. Year after year, I sent cards that came back unopened, watched photos of their parties appear online, and wondered how it felt to be erased from your own blood. I carried that silence into my new life, determined never to need them again. But one December afternoon, everything shifted. The doorbell rang, and when I opened it, the very people who had left me out stood on my doorstep speaking about family, as if nothing had happened. Why, after 12 years of shutting me out, did they suddenly come back, stay with me? Because the truth behind that visit is something you will not forget. Let me take you back to where it began. I was arranging a small vase of poinsettias on the marble counter when the sound of the doorbell carried through the house. The chime echoed in a way that made the ocean breeze outside seem even quieter. I was not expecting anyone that afternoon. I rarely had surprise visitors. My address in Carmel was not listed publicly, and I valued that privacy more than anything. With my hands still damp from the flowers, I walked toward the front door, half expecting it to be a delivery left by mistake. When I opened the door, the air seemed to leave my lungs. Standing there were 4 faces I had not seen in 12 long years. My mother, Helen, her hair now cut into a strict gray bob, eyes uncertain as they darted between me and the ground. Beside her was Richard, tall but stooped, the man who had taken over our lives after my father died. His once carefully styled hair was thin, his jaw clenched in the way I remembered too well. Just behind them stood Vanessa, his daughter, perfectly dressed as always but with lines of tension around her mouth. At her side was Ethan, her husband, whose forced smile did not reach his eyes. For a moment none of us spoke. The only sound was the wind rattling the palm fronds outside and the faint crash of waves against the rocks below. My mind raced, pulling me back to every December I had spent alone, while they filled their house with light and laughter. 12 years of Christmas parties. I was never invited to 12 years of photos online with them, smiling in matching sweaters while I sat alone in a cold apartment. Every string of lights I passed in the city had been a reminder that I no longer belonged anywhere. It was Helen who spoke first, her voice barely above a whisper. "Madeline, it has been so long." I steadied my breath, keeping my voice even. 12 years, I answered. Exactly 12 years. Richard cleared his throat, shifting as if to regain control of the moment. "This is quite a home you have. The view is impressive." I stepped aside, my hand still gripping the edge of the door. "Come in." They moved past me into the foyer, their eyes sweeping over the high ceilings, the polished stone floor, the glass wall that opened to the ocean. Their footsteps echoed faintly, hesitant and unsure. I noticed Vanessa's lips tighten as she took in the art on the walls, the subtle holiday decorations I had placed myself. A tall tree glittered in the corner of the living room, lights twinkling against the glass. The scent of fresh pine filled the space, warm and comforting to me, but I saw the flicker of unease cross Helen's face as she glanced toward the tree. "Please have a seat," I said, gesturing toward the sectional sofa. "Can I get you water, coffee, tea?" "Water is fine," Helen murmured. The others nodded. I walked into the kitchen, grateful for the moment alone. My hands trembled as I filled glasses from the filtered tap, placing them carefully on a tray. I forced myself to breathe, to remember that I was no longer the teenager they ignored. I was no longer powerless. I was not the girl standing at the edge of a party hoping someone would notice. I was the woman who built her life with no help from them. I balanced the tray in my hands and returned to the living room. They fell silent as soon as I entered, their conversation, whatever it had been, cut off mid-thought. I set the glasses on the table and sat opposite them in a single armchair. For a moment I let the sound of waves outside fill the quiet. Then I leaned forward, my eyes steady on theirs. "Why now?" I asked, my voice calm. "After 12 years of being excluded from every Christmas party, why are you here?" The question landed heavy. Helen's fingers tightened around her glass, knuckles pale. Richard's jaw flexed, as if he were about to argue, but no words came. Vanessa lowered her gaze, tracing the stitching of her handbag, as if it suddenly fascinated her. Ethan shifted uncomfortably in his seat, the smile fading altogether. I studied their faces, letting the silence stretch. I wanted them to feel the weight of those missing years, the holidays I spent eating takeout alone, the endless nights when I wondered what I had done to deserve being cut away from my own family. Every December had been another reminder that I was not wanted. They had celebrated while I built walls around my heart to survive. Richard finally cleared his throat again, his voice carrying that smooth tone. I remembered from childhood the one he used whenever he wanted to convince someone of something. Families drift apart sometimes, but blood is still blood. Blood, I repeated, my lips curling faintly. Interesting choice of words. Helen reached out a hand as if bridging a distance across the table. We thought maybe it was time. Time, I echoed, keeping my tone level. Time to what? Pretend the last 12 Christmases never happened. Pretend the silence was nothing. Pretend you did not watch me disappear. Helen's eyes filled with moisture, her lips parting, but no sound came. Vanessa shifted, still avoiding my eyes, while Ethan looked as if he wanted to speak but thought better of it. Richard finally leaned back, his face set in that familiar mask of irritation and superiority. I took a sip of water, feeling the coolness steady me. I was not going to fill the silence for them. If they had come all this way, they could explain themselves. I let my gaze move from one face to another, waiting. The clock on the mantel ticked softly, each second stretching long. Outside, the sound of gulls rose and fell with the wind. Inside, the air was thick with tension, every one of them waiting for me to soften, to offer an opening. But I had learned long ago that silence could be more powerful than words. Finally, Helen whispered, "We only wanted to see you." My eyes narrowed slightly. After 12 years, after every Christmas, you shut me out now, you just wanted to see me. No one answered. Their silence told me everything. I sat back in my chair, my hands resting calmly on the armrests, but inside my heart pounded with a mixture of anger and cold clarity. They were here for a reason, and it had nothing to do with missing me. The waves outside crashed harder against the shore, as if echoing the storm gathering between us. I knew this was only the beginning of a conversation that would strip open wounds long buried, and I was finally ready to let them see the cost of what they had done. The quiet of the room pressed in on me until my chest ached, so I let my eyes drift to the tree in the corner. Its lights blinked in soft rhythm, gold and white, against the dark window that looked out over the Pacific. The sight pulled me backward, back to a time when Christmas lights meant something very different, when I was still a little girl in Portland and my father was alive. I remembered the way my father, David, would insist on hauling home the tallest tree he could find from the local lot, even if it scraped the ceiling of our modest living room. He wore the same faded jacket every year, the elbows patched by my mother, and he always had pine needles in his hair by the time we finished setting the tree upright. My mother, Helen, would laugh at the mess while she strung popcorn with me at the kitchen table. My father said popcorn garland was prettier than anything you could buy at the store. Those nights were full of warmth. Dad would build a fire and settle me onto his lap, telling stories about brave girls who faced storms and came out stronger. He said one day I would do the same. He never used grand words, just simple promises that somehow carried the weight of truth. Every ornament we hung had a memory attached to it, some clumsy one I made in school, some old glass bulbs from his childhood. Our home was not fancy, but it was ours. On Christmas Eve, we had traditions that felt sacred to me. My father grilled even in the cold, flipping burgers in the backyard with a ridiculous wool hat on his head, while snowflakes landed on the spatula. He claimed snow gave the burgers flavor, and my mother would roll her eyes but smile anyway. Inside, I would set the table while holiday music played on the radio, my small hands arranging mismatched plates with pride. After dinner, we drank hot chocolate and opened one small gift each. I always begged for two, but Dad insisted one was enough to keep the magic alive for morning. When I think about those nights, I can still feel the glow of the fireplace and smell the mix of pine and cocoa. My father would tuck me into bed with a whispered reminder that he believed in me. I fell asleep each Christmas, believing that life, though not perfect, was safe and full of love. That illusion shattered in 2001. It was a December storm, the kind that made the freeway slick with rain and glare. My father's car never made it home. The police officer who came to the door spoke words that seemed to hang in the air without meaning, but I caught fragments. Lost control. Truck crossed the lane. Died instantly. My mother clutched my hand so tightly that night, I thought she might break the bones. People filled the house in black coats, murmuring sympathy, but I remember only the numbness, the smell of lilies, the sound of rain, the sight of my mother's face as she stared at the casket. Christmas that year was a hollow shell. There was no tree. My mother could not bear it. We sat at the kitchen table with paper plates of food brought by neighbors. I tried to eat, but the silence was unbearable. I was 12 and old enough to understand my world had been divided into before and after. I crept into my father's closet at night just to breathe in the scent of sawdust and aftershave left in his jackets. For months, my mother could hardly get out of bed. I became the one to cook simple meals, to make sure homework was done, to run a load of laundry. I was a child pretending to be an adult, terrified every moment that I would lose her too. My friends invited me to their houses, but I rarely went, afraid to leave her alone. I studied at the kitchen table while she lay in the next room, curtains drawn. When December rolled around again, I begged her to let us have a tree. Just a small one, I said. Maybe we can decorate together. Maybe it will help. She shook her head. I do not want reminders, Madeline. Her voice was flat, distant. I remember crying myself to sleep that night, clutching the last ornament my father had helped me make, a simple wooden star. That was the first Christmas I felt truly alone, even though my mother was in the next room. The house that once rang with laughter and silly songs had become heavy with grief. I wrapped the star in tissue and placed it back in its box, unsure if I would ever feel the same joy again. Years later, when strangers compliment my strength or determination, they cannot see that it began in those nights. Nights when I stood at the window watching snow cover our yard, wondering how a world could still look so beautiful when mine had fallen apart. Sitting now in my living room with a family who had turned their backs on me, I thought of those early years when I still believed love was unconditional. I thought of my father's voice telling me that storms would come, but I would endure them. His belief had been the seed I clung to in the darkest winters. Helen sipped her water, her eyes darting away when they met mine. The silence had stretched so long that I almost laughed. Did they really think they could step into my home after 12 years of absence and smooth it all over with small talk about the view? I leaned back in my chair, folding my hands in my lap, the memory of those lost Christmases pressed against my ribs like stones. The girl who once strung popcorn garlands was gone. The woman who sat before them now carried all those ghosts inside her, and she was not about to let them rewrite the story. The sound of waves crashed harder against the rocks, as if reminding me that time moves forward, no matter who is left behind. I drew a steady breath, ready to ask the questions that had haunted me since the night my father never came home. My mother's answer had always been the same whenever I tried to ask about the future after my father's death. She would sigh, fold her hands, and say that we just had to keep going. For a year I lived in that silence, until one spring afternoon she came into the kitchen dressed in clothes I had never seen before. Her hair was styled, her lipstick carefully applied. She looked more awake than she had in months, and I felt a flicker of relief. I thought she might be finding her way back. Instead, she cleared her throat and told me there was someone she wanted me to meet. His name was Richard Coleman. He was a businessman, she said, successful, kind someone who had helped her feel like living again. I was 13 and desperate for stability, so I nodded, even though the thought of someone new taking space in our lives unsettled me. The first time Richard came to the house, he filled the room with his voice. He had a booming laugh, the kind that demanded attention. He carried himself like he owned the ground he walked on. He shook my hand firmly, too firmly, and said it was a pleasure to finally meet me. I watched my mother's face light up in a way I had not seen since before my father died, and I felt a mix of gratitude and unease. That evening, I asked if he had children. My mother told me he had a daughter, Vanessa, 18 years old, and preparing for college. I pictured another girl like me, maybe someone who could be like a sister, someone who understood what it felt like to lose a parent. I was naive enough to hope. Within a few months, they announced they were getting married. The ceremony was small, just close friends and family. But I remember feeling out of place in my pale dress, standing at my mother's side while she exchanged vows with a man I barely knew. My father's photograph was not displayed anywhere. No candle lit for him, no words spoken to honor the life that had once anchored mine. I smiled when people told me I looked pretty, but inside I felt erased. After the wedding, we moved into Richard's house in Lake Oswego, a spacious home in a wealthy neighborhood with manicured lawns and winding driveways. The house smelled of polished wood and expensive candles. My new bedroom was twice the size of the one I had grown up in, with a balcony overlooking the backyard. I should have been thrilled, but the walls felt sterile and empty. No dents from my old growth chart, no paint splatters from messy art projects. It was not home. Vanessa was there the day we arrived, lounging on her bed with a glossy magazine. I knocked on her door, nervous but hopeful, and introduced myself. She did not look up from the pages as she told me we would not be sisters, that our parents' choices did not make us family. She said if I stayed out of her way, we would get along fine. Her words cut like glass. I backed out of the room humiliated and realized my hope for a sister had been foolish. Life in that house quickly revealed itself to be a performance with Richard as director. At dinner, he dominated every conversation, praising Vanessa's accomplishments and discussing his business deals. When I tried to speak about my science projects or books I was reading, he talked over me as though I had not spoken at all. My mother sat beside him, smiling weakly, encouraging me with her eyes, but never defending me. The woman who used to champion my every effort now seemed afraid to upset him. One evening, Vanessa came into my room, holding one of the photo albums I had packed from our old house. She flipped through it with a smirk before deliberately spilling soda across the pages. When I gasped, she said it was an accident, but her grin told the truth. Those were some of the last pictures I had left of my father. I cried quietly after she left, clutching the ruined pages, while the sticky smell of soda filled the room. I wanted to tell my mother, but I already knew what she would say. "Try harder, Madeline. We are all adjusting." The first Christmas in Richard's house was dazzling from the outside. The tree touched the ceiling, garlands lined the staircase, and the dining table was set for 24 guests. I stood in the hallway watching my mother laugh, with Richard's friends, her face glowing under the lights. When the photographer called for a family picture, I stepped forward instinctively. Richard blocked me with his arm and gestured to Helen and Vanessa instead. The flash went off as I stood in the shadows. That night I sat alone in my room, the muffled sound of carols drifting up the stairs. Downstairs they toasted to family, while I clutched my wooden star ornament from my father, the only piece of him I could hold on to. Over the months that followed, I noticed Richard taking control of everything. He handled the bills, the accounts, even the money my father had left for me. When I asked about the college fund, my mother dismissed me with a tired look and said Richard knew what he was doing. I learned quickly that in that house my voice did not matter. Still, I tried to carve out a place for myself. I stayed late at school, joined science club, buried myself in books. At night I wrote in a journal, pouring out words I could never say aloud. Some entries were angry, others full of longing, all of them echoing the truth that I felt invisible in the house where I now lived. There were moments when I convinced myself my mother would come back to me, that she would see how much I was struggling. But every time I tried to open up, she brushed me aside. She had become someone else, someone more concerned with keeping Richard content than with protecting me. As another holiday approached, I realized the warmth of my childhood was gone. What replaced it was a cold performance where I was an unwanted extra. My place at the table, once certain, was now conditional, dependent on Richard's mood and Vanessa's tolerance. That realization settled over me like frost. The girl who once believed Christmas meant family was learning a new lesson. In that house, love was rationed, loyalty bought, and my presence tolerated only when convenient. I understood, even at that age, that I had become a guest in my own life. The memory of that first Christmas without my father, and the first Christmas with Richard, blurred together, one filled with emptiness, the other with excess that excluded me. Both left me standing on the outside watching lights flicker through windows where I no longer belonged. It was the beginning of a pattern that would define the next decade. And I could already feel myself retreating, drawing an invisible line between the girl I had been and the one I would need to become to survive. The years that followed blurred together, each holiday season marked not by joy, but by the sharp reminder that I was only tolerated in Richard's house. From the outside, it looked perfect, the Coleman family hosting Christmas gatherings that could have been pulled straight from a glossy magazine. The trees sparkled in every corner of the photos. Vanessa stood at the center in her designer dresses, Richard's arm proudly around her, and my mother smiling with a glass of champagne, as if nothing had ever been broken in our lives. I was there in the early years, but I was never really present. My role was quiet and invisible. While the guests laughed in the living room, I was told to refill platters in the kitchen or carry coats to the upstairs closet. When the photographer called for family photos, Richard's hand would gently press against my shoulder, stopping me before I could step forward. Sometimes he did not even bother. He simply ignored me until I got the message myself. By the time I was 15, I began to anticipate the humiliation. I kept to my room when the parties grew loud, listening to Christmas carols drift upstairs, while I sat on my bed with a book I could barely focus on. My father's wooden star ornament was hidden in a box in my drawer, the only reminder that once Christmas had meant love. The last time I attended one of their gatherings was in 2011. I had put on the red dress my mother bought me, hoping to at least look like I belonged. Downstairs, the house glowed with candles, the smell of roasted turkey and cinnamon filling the air. Guests poured in, greeting Richard and Helen with warm embraces. No one looked at me twice. Later that night, when Richard raised his glass for a toast, I edged closer, waiting for some acknowledgement. He spoke of family, of blessings, of his pride in Vanessa's acceptance into her dream college. He never said my name. The applause rang in my ears as if mocking me. I remember slipping away to the backyard, the cold air stinging my cheeks as I stared at the twinkling lights inside through the window. That was the moment I knew I had been written out of their picture for good. The next December came and went without an invitation. I thought maybe it was an oversight, but when I logged onto Facebook, the truth stared back at me. There they were, dressed in matching green sweaters, smiling under the tree, arms linked, faces shining with joy. My mother was at Richard's side, her head tilted toward him as if he were the only man she had ever loved. Vanessa stood proudly in the center, with Ethan, who had begun appearing in their pictures by then. I was not in a single frame. That pattern repeated every year after. Photos of their elaborate Christmas parties appeared on social media, sometimes tagged by friends who attended. Tables covered in golden place settings, trays of champagne flutes, carolers singing on the front steps. And in every single one of those photographs, the message was clear. I was not invited. I was not wanted. I tried to tell myself it did not matter. I buried myself in schoolwork, joined the science club, spent long hours at the library. But each December carried a weight that never lessened. The world sparkled with lights and music. Yet I walked past store windows with my hands stuffed into my pockets, wishing the season would just end. One year, I tried sending a Christmas card to my mother. I wrote carefully, wishing her joy and health, telling her I missed her. A week later, the envelope returned to me, stamped in red with the words, "Return to sender." I stared at that stamp for a long time before slipping the card into a shoebox under my bed. The next year, I tried again, and the year after that. Each time the card returned unopened, piling on top of the others, until the box was nearly full. By the time I was 17, the ache of exclusion had become routine. I no longer asked my mother why I was not included, no longer begged for her time or attention. She had made her choice. Her new family was complete without me. Still, there were nights when the loneliness consumed me. I remember sitting on the steps outside the house one winter, hearing laughter spill through the windows as snow fell softly around me. I pressed my coat tighter around my body, wishing my father were still alive. He would have never allowed this, I thought. He would have made sure I had a place at that table. But he was gone, and in his absence the lines had been drawn. Richard's authority was absolute. Vanessa was the golden child, and my mother's silence sealed my fate. The years rolled forward, each Christmas another reminder of the distance between us. I poured my energy into preparing for college, desperate for a future that belonged only to me. School became my sanctuary. Every A on a test felt like a small rebellion, proof that I could thrive despite being unwanted. Teachers praised my dedication, and for a while it was enough to fill the hollow space inside. Even now, sitting in my own home, I can still remember the sharp sting of those holidays. The sound of clinking glasses downstairs while I sat upstairs alone, the return envelopes piling higher each year, the photographs online of a family that erased me. Those memories never softened. They hardened into steel inside me, shaping the woman I would become. And so each time I see Christmas lights glittering along the coast outside my window, I am reminded not just of what I lost, but of the lesson I learned. That belonging cannot be begged for. It has to be given freely. And if it is not, then you must build a life where you no longer wait at locked doors. That was the truth I carried. As I finished high school, one eye fixed firmly on the future and the other on the past that would never let me in again. I had always believed my father's college fund would be the lifeline that carried me away from Richard's house. He had spoken about it, often making sure I knew he was putting money aside so I would not have to struggle when the time came. It was a promise I held on to like oxygen, especially after he died. By my junior year of high school, I knew I needed to start preparing applications, and I needed to know exactly how much was waiting for me. One evening, I walked down the hall to Richard's office. The heavy oak door was open, and I could see him at his desk, papers spread in neat stacks, his reading glasses perched on the end of his nose. My hands were clammy as I knocked on the doorframe. He glanced up, irritation flickering across his face. "What is it, Madeline? I'm busy." I swallowed hard. "I just wanted to ask about the college fund Dad set up for me. I need to know how much is in it so I can plan." For a moment, his expression shifted into something I could not quite read. Then he leaned back in his chair, folded his hands, and said flatly, "That money has been reallocated." I froze. "Reallocated? What does that mean?" "It means it isn't there anymore," he replied without hesitation. "We needed it for Vanessa's tuition and some investments for the family." Your mother agreed. The room tilted around me. My throat went dry. But that money was for me. Dad made it clear. He said it was mine. Richard's voice hardened. "Listen carefully. While you live under my roof, you do not question my financial decisions. That money was used for this family. If you cannot understand that, perhaps you are more ungrateful than I thought." I stood there, speechless, heat rushing to my face. I could barely breathe. He turned back to his papers as if the conversation was over. My heart hammered in my chest as I walked out of the office, my legs weak beneath me. I found my mother in the kitchen chopping vegetables for dinner. She looked tired, her shoulders slumped. I blurted out what Richard had told me, desperate for her to deny it, to show anger, to protect me. She sighed and set the knife down, avoiding my eyes. "Richard knows what's best for our finances. Vanessa's tuition is expensive, and there were business opportunities. It made sense." My voice cracked. "But it was Dad's money. He saved it for me. How could you let him take it?" "Don't be so dramatic," she said sharply. "You can get student loans like everyone else, or consider community college." Her words sliced deeper than Richard's. I felt the ground give way beneath me. My own mother had chosen convenience over me, chosen to keep the peace with Richard instead of defending her daughter. That night I sat in my room, staring at the ruined photo album. Vanessa had spilled soda on the sticky pages, still faintly smelling of sugar. I thought of my father's promises, of the trust he had placed in my mother to honor his wishes, and I felt a rage building in me that I did not know what to do with. Over the next weeks, I tried to gather more information. I rifled through the desk drawers when Richard was away, searching for statements or records, but everything was locked. Once, I even saw a folder with my father's handwriting tucked beneath Richard's files. When I tried to pull it free, he appeared in the doorway, his voice sharp as a whip. "Get out of my office." I backed away, heart pounding, convinced he had seen more than he let on. Later that night, I realized the folder had vanished. The betrayal sat like lead in my stomach. I began to write in my journal more furiously than ever, filling page after page with words I could not say aloud. I wrote about how invisible I felt, how abandoned, how the people who were supposed to protect me had taken everything instead. Sometimes I scrawled the same sentence over and over until the pen ripped the paper. That money was mine. That money was mine. At school, I wore a mask. Teachers praised me for my focus, and my grades not knowing I stayed late most evenings just to avoid going home. Friends invited me to study groups, and I accepted grateful for the excuse. The library became my sanctuary, its rows of books, the only place I felt in control. Christmas that year was especially brutal. Richard hosted another lavish party, the house glowing with lights and the scent of expensive food wafting through every corner. I hovered in the background unnoticed. When the photographer lifted his camera, I stepped back before Richard had the chance to push me aside. I no longer wanted to be humiliated. I slipped upstairs, my chest tight, and watched from the window as snow began to fall. Downstairs, I heard the cheer of toasts and the clinking of glasses. My own reflection in the glass looked pale and unfamiliar. I realized then that survival meant detaching myself piece by piece. I could not stop them from taking what was mine, but I could stop them from taking more of me. One evening, not long after the holidays, I overheard Richard on the phone in his office. His voice carried through the hall, smooth and confident. Yes, the funds cleared. Her father left more than I expected. I felt the blood drain from my face. He was talking about my father's account. I leaned closer, pressing my ear against the door. There was mention of signatures, paperwork approvals. My stomach twisted. Later, when I confronted my mother again, desperate for her to finally stand up, she shook her head, tears welling in her eyes. Richard told me it was for the best. He said it was the only way. Her voice trembled, but her hands stayed busy folding laundry. I realized she was not going to fight for me. Maybe she could not. That night, I packed the shoebox of returned Christmas cards, my journal, and the wooden star ornament into a small trunk I kept under my bed. I told myself that when the time came, I would leave and never look back. The theft of my college fund was not just about money. It was proof that in Richard's house I had no claim, no rights, no safety. The man who should have been my protector had instead become the thief of my future, and my mother had let him. I stopped asking questions after that. I focused on my grades, on saving what I could from the part-time jobs I managed to find. I kept my head down and counted the days until I could graduate. Each time I walked past Richard in the hallway, each time my mother looked away, each time Vanessa smirked from the corner of the room, I reminded myself that this was temporary. One day I would be free of them. Until then, I learned to smile when required, to disappear when convenient, and to build a quiet fire of determination inside me. They had stolen my father's money, but they would not steal the future I was determined to create. Graduation day arrived on a clear June morning, the kind of day that should have been filled with joy. My classmates lined up in their caps and gowns, families waving from the bleachers, the air buzzing with excitement. I kept scanning the crowd, my eyes darting over every face, hoping to see my mother. She had promised she would come, even though Richard said he was too busy with a business meeting. As names were called, cheers and applause rose like waves. When my turn came, I walked across the stage with my diploma in hand and forced a smile for the camera. But when I looked out into the sea of faces, the seats where my mother should have been were empty. My chest tightened as if something inside me was being crushed. After the ceremony, I stood by the side of the field while students hugged their parents and posed for pictures. Laughter rang through the air, and the smell of sunscreen and flowers mixed in the breeze. I clutched my diploma against my chest, trying to look composed, but I felt like a child, again abandoned in plain sight. It was Mrs. Henderson, my English teacher, who noticed me standing alone. She walked over with her kind smile, her floral dress swaying in the breeze. "Congratulations, Madeline," she said warmly. "Highest GPA in the class. That is something to be proud of." "Thank you," I whispered, blinking back the tears that threatened to spill. She looked around, frowning slightly. "Is no one here for you today?" I shrugged, forcing a small smile. They had other commitments. She studied me for a long moment, her eyes soft with understanding. "Walk with me," she said gently. We strolled across the field as the crowd began to thin. She told me she had been following my academic journey for years and admired my determination. She knew I faced challenges at home. Then she said something that made my heart leap. "I graduated from Westridge University in Seattle. They have an incredible scholarship program for students like you. I already reached out to one of my former professors on the admissions committee. If you are interested, there might still be a chance." For the first time in years, I felt hope swell inside me. I nodded eagerly, unable to speak. With Mrs. Henderson's help, I rushed through the application. Weeks later, an envelope arrived addressed to me. My hands shook as I tore it open. I had been accepted to Westridge with a scholarship covering most of my tuition. Relief flooded me, followed quickly by determination. That evening, I walked into the living room where my mother and Richard sat watching television. I stood tall in the doorway, clutching the acceptance letter. "I got into Westridge University," I said, my voice steady. "I received a scholarship." Richard barely looked up. "That is an expensive private school. Scholarship or not, you cannot afford it." "I will be attending," I said firmly. "And I will be moving out next month." My mother's head snapped up, her eyes wide. "Moving out? Where would you go? How would you support yourself?" I took a breath, steadying myself. "I have been saving from my jobs. I already found roommates near campus." Richard stood, his face darkening. "This is ridiculous. You are not prepared to live on your own. You will come crawling back within a month." I met his glare without flinching. "I already know how difficult life is. I have been living in this house where I am treated like an unwelcome guest. I think I will manage." The argument that followed was ugly. Richard's voice rose as he called me ungrateful and foolish. My mother pleaded with me to reconsider, her voice breaking, but every word she said sounded like another attempt to protect Richard, not me. At one point, I shouted, through tears, "You let him steal my college fund. Do you even care what that did to me?" Richard stormed out of the room, slamming the door so hard the walls shook. My mother stood frozen, her face pale. When the day came for me to leave, I packed my belongings into the old Honda Civic I had bought with my savings. My hands trembled as I loaded the trunk, but my heart beat with a mixture of fear and freedom. My mother followed me outside, wringing her hands. She hugged me awkwardly at the end of the driveway. "The door is always open if you need to come back," she whispered. I looked into her eyes and asked quietly, "Is it really, Mom?" She had no answer. I got into the car, the engine sputtering before catching. As I pulled away from the house, I watched her figure shrink in the rearview mirror. My chest ached, but I did not cry. The road stretched out in front of me, leading toward Seattle, toward a new life I would build on my own terms. That first night in my apartment near campus, I lay on a mattress on the floor boxes piled around me. It was noisy, the walls thin, the neighborhood rougher than I was used to. But when I looked out the window and saw the city lights, I felt something I had not felt in years. I felt free. The silence in that tiny apartment was different from the silence in Richard's house. This silence was mine. It was the sound of possibility, of a future not yet written. For the first time, I allowed myself to believe I could shape a life that had nothing to do with them. And as I drifted to sleep that night, I whispered a promise to myself. I would never let anyone take my future again. The weeks after I moved into that cramped apartment in Seattle were some of the hardest of my life. The scholarship covered most of my tuition, but the rest was up to me. I worked 2 part-time jobs, one at a campus cafe, where I brewed endless cups of coffee for students cramming through the night, and another shelving books at the university library. Most nights I came home exhausted, my hands sore, my clothes smelling like espresso. My roommates were 3 other students, each just as broke as I was. We shared a 2-bedroom apartment, mattresses on the floor, and a refrigerator that always seemed half empty. We took turns cooking cheap meals, mostly pasta and rice, and sometimes we pooled our change to buy a single pizza on Fridays. It was not glamorous, but it was ours. Still, the nights were hardest. While other students left campus to spend weekends with their families, I stayed behind. The dorms and libraries grew quiet, and I felt the familiar ache of being left out. That first December, I tried to ignore the holiday decorations around campus. Lights strung across buildings, carols playing in the student center, professors handing out candy canes before class. Everywhere I turned was a reminder of what I did not have. On Christmas Eve, I worked the evening shift at the cafe. The streets outside were glowing with lights, couples hurrying past with shopping bags, children tugging at their parents' hands. Inside, the few customers were students like me, too far from home or too broke to leave. When my shift ended, I walked back through the freezing air to the apartment. My roommates were gone visiting their families, so the apartment was silent. I heated a can of soup, ate it alone at the small table, and sat staring at the wall. I had never felt the weight of exclusion more deeply than that night. Out of habit, I logged onto Facebook, though I knew it would hurt. There it was, the photo that had become tradition for them. Richard and Helen standing by the massive Christmas tree, Vanessa in the center with Ethan's arm around her, everyone smiling in their matching sweaters. Trays of food glistened in the background, champagne glasses raised high. The caption read, "Merry Christmas from our family to yours." My name, of course, was nowhere to be found. I closed the laptop and leaned back in my chair. The silence pressed in. I pulled out the shoebox I had brought with me, the one filled with returned Christmas cards. I traced the words "Return to Sender" stamped in red across each envelope. One by one, I laid them on the table, a timeline of rejection stretching across the scratched surface. The sight of them filled me with anger, but also with a strange kind of strength. Each card was proof that I had tried, that I had reached out again and again, even when they pretended I did not exist. The knock at the door startled me. I wasn't expecting anyone. When I opened it, I saw Alexandra from my computer science class, her arms full of Tupperware. She grinned sheepishly. "My mom made too much food and I couldn't finish it alone. Thought you might like some." I blinked, surprised. "Thank you," I managed, stepping aside to let her in. We sat on the floor eating her mother's homemade tamales and laughing about professors we both disliked. Alexandra's warmth was effortless, and for the first time in years I felt like I belonged somewhere, even if it was just on that thin carpet with paper plates balanced on our knees. As midnight approached, she pulled out her phone and showed me a photo of her family gathered around their tree. Her parents, her younger brother, her grandmother smiling wide. They had set aside a stocking for her even though she was away at school. I felt a pang in my chest, but also a deep gratitude that she was sharing it with me. "Why aren't you with them?" I asked. She shrugged. "Plane tickets are expensive, but honestly, I don't mind. I wanted to be here tonight." Her words settled into me like balm. For the first time in a long time, I did not feel invisible. Over the next years at Westridge, Alexandra became the sister I never had. Her family welcomed me during holidays, inviting me to their modest house in Tacoma. Her mother hugged me tightly the first time we met, and her father insisted I sit at the head of the table because I was their guest. At first, I fought tears during those visits, overwhelmed by the kindness, but slowly I began to let myself accept it. Yet even with their warmth, I could not forget the sharp ache of being excluded. Every December, I still saw the photos posted by Richard and Helen, the glittering parties, the captions about family. Sometimes I wondered if they ever thought of me at all, but I no longer let those thoughts drown me. Instead, I poured my energy into my studies, coding late into the night, dreaming of a future where I would never have to depend on anyone again. By senior year, I was known around campus for my discipline. Professors recommended me for internships, classmates sought my help with projects. But the memory of those lonely holidays never left me. They became fuel driving me forward when exhaustion threatened to pull me under. I knew then that I could not change my past, but I could build a future so solid that no one could erase me from it. And each time I passed a decorated tree on campus or heard a Christmas carol playing faintly from a radio, I reminded myself that even though they had shut me out, I was still here. I was still standing, and one day I would create a life where the seat at the table was mine by choice, not by invitation. Graduation from Westridge came faster than I expected, and with it came the pressure to decide what kind of life I wanted to build. My professors encouraged me to take offers from established tech firms in Seattle, companies that promised stable salaries and benefits. For a while, I considered it. The thought of finally having a steady paycheck and health insurance felt like the safe choice after years of scraping by. But a small idea had been growing inside me since junior year. It started as a class project, a simple mobile app meant to help students manage deadlines and finances. I had lived the struggle of juggling work classes and bills, and I knew I wasn't the only one. The prototype I built for a course assignment had been clumsy, but when my classmates tried it, their feedback was enthusiastic. After graduation, I decided to give it more than just late-night attention. I moved into a tiny studio in downtown Seattle, trading the noise of roommates for the quiet of my own four walls. The apartment doubled as my office. A futon folded against the wall by day became my bed at night. My desk was covered with sticky notes and lines of code scrawled across old notebooks. I lived on ramen, instant coffee, and determination. There were nights I stayed up until 3 in the morning, debugging code only to wake at 6, to work a temporary data entry job that kept me afloat. My savings dwindled, but every time I considered quitting, I remembered the cold Christmas nights when my family laughed without me. I wanted more than survival. I wanted to create something that mattered, something no one could take away. The breakthrough came when I presented my app at a small local tech meetup. I stood nervously at the front of the room, demoing the features on an outdated laptop, trying to sound confident while my hands shook. When I finished, a man approached me. He introduced himself as Daniel Ramirez, an angel investor who liked to support early-stage startups. "Your concept is solid," he said, handing me his card. "But what impressed me most was how well you understood your users. You clearly lived this problem." A week later, after a coffee meeting where I spilled my nerves along with half my latte, Daniel offered me $60,000 for a 20% stake in my fledgling company. It was not a huge amount by industry standards, but to me it felt like a fortune. More importantly, he became a mentor. He walked me through things I had never considered, like contracts, marketing, and investor relations. He introduced me to people who could help me refine my vision. With his support, I officially launched the app, which I called Campus Link. The response exceeded anything I imagined. Students across the city downloaded it. Reviews praised its simplicity and usefulness. Word spread to other campuses, and soon we had users at universities across Washington and Oregon. For the first time in my life, I saw something I had built catch fire. The revenue from premium features trickled in slowly at first, but enough to cover expenses. I hired a fellow Westridge graduate to help with development, then a marketing student who knew how to get attention on social media. Our office was still my studio cables, snaking across the floor, empty coffee cups stacked like trophies, but we were building something real. Success did not come without obstacles. Competitors tried to mimic our features. Servers crashed during finals week, leaving me awake for 48 hours straight trying to fix the bugs. Once I broke down crying on the bathroom floor, convinced it was all going to fall apart. But each time I pushed through. Daniel told me once, startups are like storms. You either learn to bend with the wind or you break. I chose to bend. By the second year, Campus Link had tens of thousands of active users. Investors started to circle, and I moved operations into a modest office space above a bookstore in downtown Seattle. Walking into that office each morning, seeing my small team working together, filled me with a pride I had never known. When December rolled around that year, I strung a strand of lights around the office windows and bought a small artificial tree. On Christmas Eve, instead of loneliness, I sat with my team eating takeout Chinese food and toasting with plastic cups of soda. They laughed, shared stories of their families, and treated me like one of their own. For the first time in over a decade, I felt like I belonged to something bigger than myself. Still, I could not ignore the ache when I scrolled through Facebook and saw my mother's smiling face next to Richard at yet another extravagant party. Vanessa stood radiant in a sequin gown, Ethan by her side. The caption said, "Cheers to family, our greatest blessing." I closed the app quickly, reminding myself that I had a family of my own now, one I had chosen. The more Campus Link grew, the more I felt the shadows of my past pushing me forward. Each new user, each positive review, each piece of revenue was proof that I had built a life without them. The seat at the table was finally mine, not offered by pity or obligation, but claimed through my own effort. Late one night after another exhausting week of 12-hour days, I sat alone in the office with the glow of the tree lights reflecting in the window. I thought about my father and how he used to tell me stories of brave girls who grew up to change the world. For the first time, I believed he might have been right. The snow outside fell softly against the city streets, muffling the noise. I closed my laptop and leaned back in my chair, letting the quiet sink in. For years, I had been haunted by exclusion, by returned cards and unopened letters. But sitting there in my own office in a company I had built from nothing, I realized those ghosts no longer held the same power. I still carried the scars, but they were not weights anymore. They were reminders of where I had been and how far I had come. And as the lights flickered on the little plastic tree, I knew this was only the beginning. The following spring, everything changed in ways I could not have predicted. CampusLink was approached by a larger tech company, Redwood Systems, about a potential acquisition. At first, I brushed it off, assuming it was just another corporate giant trying to swallow something small. But when Daniel sat me down and explained what it could mean, I realized the opportunity was bigger than anything I had ever imagined. They wanted to buy CampusLink outright, but keep me on as CEO with full creative control. The offer was staggering, more money than I had ever seen written in one place. For days, I barely slept, pacing the tiny office, weighing the choice. Selling meant giving up the independence I had clung to for so long, but it also meant security and resources to expand globally. After weeks of negotiations, I signed the deal. Overnight, I went from scraping by on ramen to being worth millions. My name appeared in business magazines' articles, highlighting the young woman who had built a startup from nothing. Emails flooded in, some congratulatory, others opportunistic. For the first time, the world seemed to see me. With the money, I bought a modern beachfront house in Carmel, a place with floor-to-ceiling windows and the constant sound of waves. It was far more space than one person needed: 5 bedrooms and an open-plan living room that looked out over the Pacific. But I wanted it. After years of cramped apartments and borrowed couches, I wanted something that was entirely mine. The first night I stood barefoot on the deck, the ocean stretching endlessly before me, I felt both exhilarated and lonely. Success could not erase the ache of what I had lost, but it gave me something I had never known before: power over my own life. It was around that time that Alexandra, who had been at my side since college, convinced me to consider therapy. I resisted at first, pride telling me I had survived on my own, but deep down I knew she was right. Success had not healed the scars of exclusion, the bitterness that lingered every December. So I sat in an office in Monterey, across from Dr. Weber, a woman with kind eyes, who let me speak in long, tangled sentences. I told her about the stolen college fund, the returned letters, the photographs of parties I had never been invited to. She listened without judgment, occasionally asking gentle questions that cut deeper than I expected. One afternoon, after I confessed how small and unwanted I had felt for so many years, she leaned forward and said softly, "What happened to you was not your fault. You were a child who deserved love and protection. The adults failed you. You did not fail them." Those words cracked something open in me. For years I had carried the belief that I must have done something to deserve being left out, that maybe I had not been lovable enough. Hearing her say otherwise loosened a weight I had lived with for too long. In therapy, I began to understand that forgiveness was not about excusing what they had done, but about releasing the hold their actions had over me. I could not change Richard's cruelty or my mother's silence, but I could decide how much power those memories had in shaping my present. At the same time, I wanted to give back. The pain of those years had carved out a sharp awareness of how many young people struggled without support. With part of the money from the acquisition, I established the Taylor Foundation, a scholarship fund for students who, like me, had been left to fend for themselves. But I did not stop at financial aid. I added mentorship, counseling, and workshops to help them navigate the challenges of adulthood without family backing. The first time I met a group of scholarship recipients, I had to step out of the room and compose myself. Their faces, nervous but hopeful, reminded me of who I had been at 17, clutching my acceptance letter, like it was the only rope keeping me from drowning. When I spoke to them, I told pieces of my story. Not the whole truth, not yet, but enough for them to see that I understood. Each success story that came from the foundation felt like a quiet victory. Every student who graduated, everyone who found their footing, reminded me that the darkness I had endured could be transformed into light for someone else. Still, every December I felt the sting. I would decorate my own tree, invite friends and colleagues over for dinner, fill the house with laughter. But late at night, when the dishes were washed and the lights dimmed, I sometimes opened my phone and saw the familiar pictures. Richard and Helen, with their arms around Vanessa and Ethan, champagne glasses, raised high the caption, "Always the same family." The word cut me every time. They had spent over a decade building memories without me erasing me from their story. I told myself it no longer mattered that I had built a new family through friendships and work, but part of me, small and wounded, still yearned for what I had lost. One evening after a holiday gala for the foundation, I drove home along the coast with the windows down, the salty air whipping against my face. I thought of my father, of how he used to tell me that storms would come, but I would endure them. I wondered what he would think if he could see me now standing in front of donors, telling a story of resilience that began with his absence. As I pulled into the driveway of my house, the lights from the Christmas tree shone faintly through the windows. I carried the weight of the night on my shoulders, equal parts pride and sorrow. Success had given me freedom, but it had not given me closure. That winter, as I sat alone on the deck with a blanket around my shoulders, the waves crashing below, I made another quiet vow to myself. If the past ever came knocking, I would no longer shrink back. I would face it head on, not as the girl who had been left out, but as the woman who had built her own place in the world. And though I did not know it then, the past was already on its way back to my door. The doorbell rang on a quiet Sunday afternoon, the sound echoing through the open spaces of my house. I wasn't expecting anyone. My closest friends always texted before stopping by, and the neighbors rarely came unannounced. I wiped my hands on a dish towel, still smelling faintly of the lemon I had been slicing for tea, and walked toward the front door with mild irritation. When I opened it, my breath caught in my chest. Standing there were 4 figures I hadn't seen in 12 years, their faces both familiar and foreign. My mother, Helen, her once dark hair now gray, and styled neatly, eyes darting nervously between me and the ground. Richard stood stiff beside her, thinner now, but his presence still heavy, his eyes sharp. Vanessa, polished as always in a tailored coat, and Ethan, her husband, with a strained smile that looked rehearsed. For a moment none of us spoke. The wind from the ocean carried the faint scent of salt and pine through the doorway, filling the silence. My chest tightened, but I kept my expression calm. "Hello, Helen," finally whispered. "It has been so long." 12 years, I answered evenly. "Exactly 12 years." Richard cleared his throat, his gaze sweeping past me into the house. "You've done well for yourself? This is quite the place." I didn't move from the doorway at first, but standing there like strangers in my front yard felt absurd. "Come in," I said finally, stepping aside. They filed past me into the foyer, their eyes widening as they took in the high ceilings, the marble floors, the view of the ocean stretching wide through the glass walls. Vanessa's lips pressed together, a flicker of something, envy or discomfort, passing across her face. "Please have a seat," I said, gesturing toward the living room. "Would you like some water?" "Water's fine," Helen murmured quickly. The others nodded. I walked to the kitchen, grateful for the distance, and filled 4 glasses with filtered water. My hands trembled slightly as I placed them on a tray. I forced a breath. This was my house, my life. They had no power here. When I returned, they were whispering among themselves, voices cut off as I entered. I set the glasses down, sat across from them, and folded my hands in my lap. So I said calmly, "What brings you here after 12 years? And how did you even find me?" My mother and Richard exchanged a glance before she spoke. "We read about you in Business Weekly. It mentioned you lived in this area. hired someone to find the address. Her cheeks colored slightly as if she knew how invasive that sounded. That was resourceful, I replied, my tone cool. Vanessa leaned forward, her polished nails wrapped around the glass of water. We've been following your success, your company, the foundation. It's impressive. I raised an eyebrow but didn't answer. I waited. They had come to me, and I wanted them to reveal why. Finally, Helen cleared her throat. We thought it was time to reconnect. Family should not be apart for so long. Family. The word tasted bitter. I studied their faces, each one avoiding my gaze except Ethan, who looked at me with something closer to honesty than the others. Move forward, Richard added quickly, his voice rehearsed. The past is behind us. I tilted my head, letting the silence stretch until they shifted uncomfortably. Move forward. And what does that look like to you? Their expressions tightened. It was Vanessa who broke the silence. Ethan's business has been going through some challenges. With the baby on the way, things are a little complicated. Congratulations, I said evenly, meaning it despite everything. A child deserved well wishes no matter who the parents were. Thank you, she murmured. Richard leaned forward, his voice carrying the same persuasive edge I remembered from my teenage years. Families support each other, especially in hard times. We thought, given your success, perhaps you could invest in Ethan's company. Or offer a loan. The bluntness of his words made the air feel heavier. I sat back, crossing my legs. So this is why you came? No, Helen interjected quickly, her voice shaky. We wanted to see you truly. The financial part is separate. Is it? I asked, my eyes locking on hers. For 12 years there were no calls, no visits, no invitations to Christmas. Not even when I sent cards with my address year after year. But now suddenly family matters again. Because you need something. Helen's face paled. Vanessa shifted in her seat, her hand gripping Ethan's. Richard, however, did not flinch. He met my gaze with the same authority he had always wielded. This is not about the past, Madeline. We've all made mistakes. What matters is now. I let out a soft laugh, not from humor but disbelief. You want to erase 12 years of silence, 12 years of exclusion with a single conversation. The waves outside crashed against the rocks, filling the pause that followed. My heart pounded, but my voice stayed calm. I had waited too long for this moment to let them control it. I leaned forward, resting my elbows lightly on my knees. Tell me, if I had failed, if I were struggling instead of successful, would you be sitting here in my living room right now? Their silence was answer enough, and as I looked into their pale faces, I realized that for the first time, I was not the one on the outside. They were. I rose from my chair without another word and walked down the hall to my office. My pulse pounded in my ears as I unlocked the bottom drawer of my desk and pulled out a large manila envelope. For years I had kept it hidden, uncertain whether I would ever have the courage to show anyone what was inside. Now, it felt inevitable. When I returned to the living room, they all turned toward me, their faces tight with unease. I set the envelope on the coffee table and slid it toward them. No one moved to touch it. Do you know what this is? I asked quietly. Richard's jaw flexed. Vanessa frowned. Helen blinked at me, confusion written across her face. These, I continued, are the Christmas cards and letters I sent to you every year. 12 years of them. Birthdays, holidays, even ordinary days, when I just wanted you to know I was thinking of you. Every single one came back unopened. I pulled a handful from the envelope, spreading them across the table. The red stamps screamed return to sender year after year, my handwriting growing steadier as I grew older. Helen's hand shot to her mouth. I never saw these, she whispered, her voice trembling. My eyes locked on Richard. Did you intercept her mail? He looked at me with cold defiance, saying nothing. The silence was louder than any admission. My throat tightened, but I forced myself to keep speaking. I also sent emails. I turned my tablet toward them, scrolling through messages marked as read, but never answered. And text messages, too, delivered ignored. Vanessa shifted uncomfortably. Madeline, the past is the past. We're here now. Are you? I asked, my voice sharper now. Or are you here because you want something from me? The air in the room grew heavier. Ethan finally spoke, his voice low but steady. "We approached this wrong. My business is in trouble, serious trouble. We're at risk of losing everything. The house, the cars, our savings. The baby is coming and we're scared." At least his honesty was something. "Thank you for being straightforward," I told him. Richard seized on the opening, leaning forward. "So you'll help. A loan, an investment, whatever you think is fair. With your business experience, it could benefit everyone." I shook my head slowly. "No, Richard, I'm not giving you money." Helen's eyes filled with tears. Vanessa's face fell. Ethan looked down at his hands. Only Richard reacted with fury. "After all this talk of family, you're going to turn your back on us when we need you." I kept my voice calm. "I'm not turning my back. I'm setting boundaries. I will not pretend the past never happened. And I will not ignore that your sudden interest in me began the moment you needed financial help." I turned to Ethan. "If you want me to review your business plan, I will. I can offer guidance, maybe connect you to people who could help, but I won't hand you money. Trust has to be earned." Richard shot to his feet, his face flushed. "This is ridiculous. We came here in good faith, and you treat us like con artists." "No," I said, staying seated. "I'm treating you like people who hurt me deeply and never once apologized. That's not paranoia, that's memory." Helen reached out to touch Richard's arm, pleading softly. "Sit down." He yanked his arm away but didn't leave. Finally, she turned to me, tears running down her cheeks. "I failed you, Madeline. I should have protected you. I should have been a better mother. I can never undo what I did, but I am sorry." Her words struck something deep in me. For years I had longed to hear her acknowledge the truth. My chest ached, but I nodded slowly. "Thank you for saying that." Vanessa's eyes brimmed with tears. "I never hated you," she said suddenly. "I was jealous. Dad always praised you even when he was hard on you. I felt like I could never measure up. That's why I pushed you away. It was wrong, and I'm sorry too." Her confession startled me. For so long I had believed she despised me, that her cruelty came from disdain. Hearing jealousy in her voice reframed everything, though it did not erase the pain. "Thank you for telling me," I said softly. Ethan cleared his throat. "I'll send you the business plan if you'll still look at it." I nodded. "Send it," Richard muttered under his breath and strode toward the door. Helen followed after a lingering glance back at me. Vanessa hesitated, then whispered, "I hope this isn't the last time we see you." When the door finally closed and their car pulled away, silence returned to the house. My body felt heavy, as though every muscle had been holding tension for hours. I sank into the chair, staring at the envelope of unopened letters still on the table. For the first time in 12 years, I had spoken my truth to them. I had not screamed or begged. I had simply shown them the cost of what they had done and refused to carry the weight alone any longer. And as the waves crashed outside, I felt something shift inside me. Not forgiveness, not yet, but a release. A loosening of chains I had worn since the night I was first told I wasn't welcome at their table. The days after their visit passed in a strange quiet, as if the house itself was catching its breath. I went back to my work, to the foundation, to the routines that had always grounded me, but something had shifted. For the first time, I no longer carried the burden of wondering if I had been the one to cut ties. They had seen the proof, the returned cards, and unopened letters. The truth was no longer mine alone to hold. 6 weeks later, an email from my mother appeared in my inbox. It was brief, written in the halting style of someone who did not know how to bridge a chasm. She apologized again and asked if we could talk by phone. I hesitated before answering, but eventually I gave her my number and suggested a time. The call was awkward, filled with long pauses and careful words, but it was also a beginning. Over the next few months, those calls became weekly, slowly building a rhythm that felt tentative but real. Helen told me she and Richard had started seeing a marriage counselor. She admitted things had not been good for years, that she had been afraid of being alone again after my father died, afraid of what it would mean to break the life she had built. For the first time in decades, she spoke about my father, openly sharing memories I thought I had been left to carry by myself. I told her some of mine, and in those moments we found small points of connection that had been missing for so long. Around that time, Ethan reached out with the business plan he had promised. I read through it carefully, making notes and offering suggestions. The idea had merit, but the execution needed work. I connected him with a couple of people I trusted in the industry who could give him honest feedback. He thanked me sincerely, and though I kept my distance, I sensed he valued my help. Months later, he emailed again to share that Vanessa had given birth to a baby girl named Lily. He included a photo of the tiny infant swaddled in a blanket, her eyes closed tight. I sent a gift basket, simple but heartfelt, and wished them well. Richard remained absent. He refused to join the calls with Helen, declined invitations when she suggested meeting in person. His pride, it seemed, was stronger than any desire to reconcile. Oddly, I found I could live with that. Some doors once closed do not need to reopen. What surprised me most during this time was how my own feelings began to change. The fury that had burned so hot inside me for years cooled into something else, not forgiveness exactly, but perspective. I could see Richard's need for control as the shield of a man who feared his own inadequacy. I could see Vanessa's cruelty for what it was, the jealousy of a young woman who never felt secure in her father's love. And I could see my mother's silence as the choice of someone who had been too afraid to lose stability, even at the cost of losing her child. Understanding did not erase the harm, but it lightened the weight of it. I no longer felt bound to their mistakes. That December, the foundation hosted its annual gala in San Francisco. Students I had mentored stood at the podium sharing stories of resilience and triumph. As I watched them, I felt a swell of pride that brought tears to my eyes. When it was my turn to speak, I told my story more openly than ever before. I spoke of exclusion, of rejection, of learning to build a life when the people who should have been your family chose not to be. I ended by saying that forgiveness was not something we do for others, but something we do for ourselves to free our own hearts to move forward. After the applause, as I greeted donors and students, I saw my mother standing quietly by the exit. She had not told me she was coming. Her eyes were red from crying, her shoulders drawn but steady. When I reached her, she took my hands in hers. "I am proud of you," she said, "not just for what you built, but for who you are." I held her hands for a long moment, feeling the fragility of them, the weight of all that had been lost, and the fragile thread of what could still be saved. We embraced, and, for the first time since I was a child, I allowed myself to believe that part of our bond might survive after all. The road ahead was not perfect. Some relationships would never heal. Richard would likely remain a closed door, Vanessa would always be at a distance, but I had stopped waiting for them to choose me. I had chosen myself, and that was enough. Now, each Christmas, I decorate my tree with ornaments collected over the years. At the very top, I place the small wooden star my father carved for me. It has survived every move, every storm, every silence. It reminds me that even when love is cut short, its imprint lasts. And as I sit in my home, the sound of the ocean filling the air, I feel peace. Not because the past has been erased, but because I have woven it into something stronger, something that belongs to me. What about you? Has there been a moment in your life when you had to choose yourself after being excluded, when you had to set boundaries that hurt but ultimately freed you? I would love to hear your thoughts in the comments. If my story resonated with you, please like this video and subscribe so you can hear more true stories of resilience, family drama, betrayal, and the strength it takes to rise above them. And if you know someone who might need to hear this, share it with them. Sometimes knowing we are not alone is the first step toward healing. This is Madeline Taylor thanking you for listening and wishing you the strength to claim your own seat at the table.